Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying your Wednesday and welcome to Disgorged Online. I'm Zach Jabal. Before quarantine time, was the wine educator for Tom Douglas Restaurants. I'm the host and producer of the Vine Pair podcast, which you can find on podcast platforms left and right. Just search for Vine Pair, Vinepair. I've written about wine and sold and served wine for quite a long time now, and I am here doing these videos to talk about wine, have an excuse to open some wine and drink it. Not that I need much of one, and I am excited that you're all here to watch. So today we're going to be diving into Cabernet Sauvignon from Red Mountain. In particular, I have the 2015 Camerata from Cadence. Cadence's winery actually here in Seattle. Their winery is down in South Seattle. And this is from their vineyard on Red Mountain, the Caramia vineyard. This is 90% Cabernet Sauvignon, 10% Merlot. And we'll get into this wine, this specific wine, and some specifics about Cabernet Sauvignon from Washington and Red Mountain in particular here in a few minutes. But I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the grape because, of course, Cabernet Sauvignon is one of the most widely planted, well-known, and beloved varieties in the world of wine. And it's interesting. It has an interesting story, I think, and I won't go into too many details other than to say that the story starts in Bordeaux. Excuse me. So I'm already off to a rousing start here. So we started in Bordeaux in the southwestern part of France, and that's the birthplace of the variety. It is a cross the offspring of Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. And the variety itself is widely established throughout Bordeaux, of course, but has since become one of, like I said, the most widely planted varieties pretty much anywhere on the planet. You can find anywhere that makes wine, with some few exceptions, you can find some Cabernet Sauvignon. There are some good reasons for that, which I will get into in a minute. But the important thing to know about Cabernet Sauvignon and its dominance in Bordeaux, especially on the left bank in the sort of many of the most preeminent appellations and in even some of the most highly regarded wines on the planet, is that it's a relatively recent phenomenon. The early success of Bordeaux had much more to do with other varieties, Merlot to some extent, Malbec, but the problem is basically Cabernet Sauvignon is relatively, it's not easy to grow, but it's relatively hardy. And when all of those vines were destroyed by phylloxera in the middle to later part of the 1800s, they were replanted and almost entirely to Cabernet Sauvignon because Cabernet was a little easier to grow than Malbec in particular, and Carmenere, which was another variety that was essentially decimated by that whole the whole phylloxera epidemic for vines. It very much was. And so we now associate Cabernet Sauvignon with these great appellations, but really when they were first making their names for themselves, Cabernet Sauvignon was at most a component, not the dominant variety the way it is now. And I mentioned it's a little bit easy to grow. It has some characteristics that make it particularly well suited to a lot of different growing regions. It's a relatively late budding and late ripening variety, so it doesn't do great in places where there's risk of early onset of frost or cold weather, but it does do well in places with less predictable springs, and that's definitely Bordeaux. Bordeaux is is on the Atlantic Ocean, and so there's a lot of unpredictable weather, especially in spring. The latter part of the growing season is a little bit more consistently suitable. It also produces very thick-skinned grapes that are quite small, and both of those characteristics will play into what I talk about when we get to the specifics of this wine. But it makes it particularly well suited to produce sort of highly tannic wines that are suitable for and perhaps even necessitate long aging. And those are characteristics of Cabernet Sauvignon almost wherever it's grown, is that the wines tend to not just benefit from, but often to some extent demand a certain amount of aging and or time open. So to speak of the wine I opened this bottle 2 hours ago. Some people were asking on Facebook earlier today what time to open. I think with most Cabernet Sauvignon, your safe bet is 90 minutes before you intend to drink it. You can open it even sooner or even earlier than that. It's not that if you open it and drink it right away, it won't taste good. It's just you'll kind of get the most I think the best expression of the wine if you do give it a little bit of time to open. You can certainly also decant. If you're going to decant the wine, I would say you can probably cut 30 minutes or so off that opening time. The decanting will help introduce more oxygen than just removing the cork will, for sure. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're expecting to find in the glass. And a lot of what I'm going to say as far as tasting notes will be general to Cabernet Sauvignon, in particular from let's say, not so much Bordeaux, but let's say what you'll get here is often what you will find Cabernet Sauvignon from places like Washington State, much of California where it's grown, other New World climates like or new growing areas like South Africa, Australia. You might even find this with Chile or things like that. Not every single wine is going to show all of these characteristics, but they're pretty common for Cabernet Sauvignon from these sort of newer sites in the world. So on the nose, we're gonna get sort of an interesting mix of dark fruit. So a lot of black cherry is kind of the most common fruit that we associate with Cabernet Sauvignon, both on the nose and on the palate, but also black currant. I think you often find a lot of kind of plum notes in this. Some of that will be. It's particularly clear to me you get some more plum character when the wine is blended with Merlot, which itself tends to be very plummy in its fruit profile. So that can kind of accentuate that. Not so much on this wine, but on others that you might be drinking, you might find a little more kind of blackberry fruit. There's that sort of, kind of that sweeter black fruit character that can come out of a lot of these New World Cabernet Sauvignons as well, both on the nose and on the palate. But part of the reason for Cabernet Sauvignon's popularity and acclaim has to do with all the other kind of characteristics that you can pick up on, in particular the nose, but also on the palate of this wine. And those are things like tobacco and wood smoke. To me, this wine in particular has a really pronounced kind of note of like pencil shavings. It's got that kind of graphite quality. Those of you, which is probably most of you watching this, have sharpened a pencil in your life, and there's that very kind of pronounced smell that you get right when you get those sort of fresh shavings. It's kind of a wood and, I guess graphite or lead, depending on just how old you are, smell. And the other kind of notes that you might pick up, and this will be especially common in wines that have seen a fair amount of oak, especially new oak, which is extremely common with a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon. I get a lot of coffee or mocha notes. So there's a kind of a chocolate and coffee character that can come through, along sometimes with more pure vanilla, clove. Those kinds of things are very common on these wines. And those are an interaction to some extent of the aromatics that are present in the wine, along with the oak, the aromas that the oak aging adds to the mix. As far as on the palate, I find that with many Cabernet Sauvignons, especially from Washington, but also from other places, the fruit tends to be a little less ripe than you smell. Now, this can be definitely not the case if you get, say, a Cabernet Sauvignon from the really, really hot places in the world, like a Paso Robles Cabernet Sauvignon, or from certain parts of Australia. You might get really lush, juicy fruit. You might get it from certain California, like Napa Cabernet as well, where they're possibly really letting the wine, the grapes hang on the vine for a really long amount of time to get all this, sort of really concentrated fruit flavors, and you're going to get real ripe, almost kind of raisiny fruit character. But it's not my personal preference in Cabernet, and the stuff I tend to like from the New World has that really kind of ripe fruit nose. It's very inviting in that regard, but the profile on the palate is a little more tart, not like underripe or anything. Just it's just nicely fresh. It's not overwhelmingly kind of dried or jammy. You also might get a certain flavor impression of those same kind of chocolate coffee notes that I mentioned on the nose. Again, depending on how much oak was used on the wine and a little bit how young it is, those flavors will be more evident in youth than they are with a little bit of age. And then the other thing to take note of with the wine, and I mentioned a little bit when I was describing the grape itself, is because Cabernet Sauvignon tends to produce small, thick-skinned grapes, the wines tend to be quite tannic. And so a lot of the winemaking challenge that surrounds Cabernet Sauvignon is figuring out how do you want to manage those tannins. And there are techniques that have been developed. There's a number of them that are, in some cases, about being very gentle with the grapes and the skins as you're sort of making the wine, to perhaps limit the extraction of some of the harsher tannins. The flip side is some producers are really looking to extract a lot of tannin, and so you will see very long macerations or extraction periods with these wines. Again, that's a winemaker to winemaker specific decision, and so it's not always consistent. Even if you look at the same region or even same vineyard, sometimes you will see winemakers take different approaches in the winemaking methodology. Before we move on to a few other things, I did also want to touch on just this idea that Cabernet Sauvignon is a variety that we do sometimes see, or we often see as a varietal wine, meaning 100% of the single variety, or at least a high percentage, as in the case of this wine, 90%. And yet, I tend to find that rarely, not always, but rarely do I find the single variety, the 100% Cabernet Sauvignon wines to be as enjoyable as wines with some other blending component. The most common is Merlot. That's sort of the classic blending partner for Cabernet Sauvignon in Bordeaux, but you will often find it blended with, in addition to Merlot, Cabernet Franc, sometimes Malbec, sometimes Petit Verdot. Those are other blending grapes in Bordeaux. You can also find it, like in Washington State, you'll sometimes see it blended with Syrah. There are some other possibilities as well. I mean, in most parts of the world, you can do kind of whatever you want. So you might see Cabernet Sauvignon blended with just about anything, frankly. But the reason that I find that these blends tend to be a little bit more approachable, even if the wine is dominated by Cabernet Sauvignon, is that the one thing that Cabernet Sauvignon tends to lack, and if you're tasting your wine and thinking about this, you might notice it, is it's got a lot of flavor up front, and it tends to have a lot of these sort of structural elements, tannins and acid in particular. But what it doesn't have is, it doesn't have as much heft, as much weight on the palate as you might think. Cabernet Sauvignon can actually produce some pretty austere, kind of lean wines. And that's one of the reasons why some of these producers in California and other places let these wines get really, really ripe. The idea there is that you're going to get so much through the fermentation process, so much glycerol and possibly residual sugar. It's going to lend more body to the wine. But blending in a more sort of full-bodied or just broader variety like Merlot can also kind of can add that characteristic without necessarily doing something extreme on the grape growing side, and tends to be more my personal preference. So to come back to the Cabernet Sauvignon story for a moment. So as I mentioned, it's associated with some of the most prestigious, expensive wines of the world, which are some of the first growth wines in particular of Bordeaux. And in all of those wines, it's the principal variety. And that has a lot to do with why it's planted all over the world. But that doesn't explain necessarily its dominance at the moment, because at the moment we wouldn't necessarily think of those wines as being the paragon. I mean, they're great wines of the world for a reason, but they're not necessarily what producers aspire to make these days exactly. Some people do, for sure. But the other big part of this is that the influence in the 70s, especially in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, of wine critics and wine reviewers like Robert Parker and others really kind of promoted Cabernet Sauvignon as a variety, and the style that I described from California, these sort of really big, hedonistic, ripe, sort of blow your socks off styles. And that they became not just critically acclaimed, but extremely successful commercially. The prices for those wines that were very highly scored, certainly 100-point wines, but even wines in the 95 to 100 range would really make or break a winery. And there was a lot of people who said, "Oh, well, if that's the style of wine that's going to sell for hundreds of dollars and is going to get me, international acclaim, I will make that." There was also sort of a small cadre of consultants essentially who would come in and say basically, "Hey, look, you want to make a wine that's going to get 98 or more points? Here's exactly what you have to do. Here's the ripeness you need. Here's the concentration you need. Here's the barrels you need. Here's the methodology you need." And that worked for a lot of people. I think the unfortunate side to that whole trend, I guess, is that you ended up with a lot of wines that were the same, right? And it no longer kind of mattered where they were from. They all tasted sort of similar. And so, a wine from South Australia and a wine from Washington and a wine from California could pretty easily be, passed off as one or the other. And at their best, I think all of those wines should show some different character. That would be, I think, to me, sort of the point of growing grapes in these different places, is to some extent to have the wines that are made from them taste a little bit different. They can be stylistically similar, of course, and certainly if you're using Cabernet Sauvignon as your variety, or the sort of principal variety in a blend, it's all going to have that Cabernet Sauvignon signature. But the wines all kind of tasting the same was an unfortunate side effect. I mentioned, and I'll just run through really quickly, a couple of some of the places that I think are best to look for Cabernet Sauvignon if it's a variety that you like. So obviously Bordeaux, as I mentioned. That said, most of the wine in Bordeaux is not made from Cabernet Sauvignon. Most of the red wine is actually based, Merlot based. But what you want to look for if you're looking for Cabernet Sauvignon from Bordeaux is you want to look for the broader appellation on the left bank of the Gironde, which is the Haut-Médoc, Haut-Medoc. And then in there are a few named villages that are kind of the most preeminent. Those would be Saint-Estèphe, Saint-Julien, Pauillac, Margaux, and then Grave, which is not technically the same part, but further south along the Gironde is also a really highly regarded village for Cabernet Sauvignon-based wines. That said, you can also find some really good Cabernet Sauvignon-based wines from other parts of Bordeaux. You just have to know a little bit more and do a little bit more looking. It's harder to say just from the village name or the broader appellation name what the variety or varieties will be. And like I said, most of the right bank or the other wines are going to be Merlot or Cabernet Franc based or both. Certainly California, Napa Valley most famously, but lots of other parts of California grow Cabernet Sauvignon. I myself am particularly partial to some of the wines from some of the higher elevation vineyards. So some of the mountain or sort of mountain vineyards in Napa, but also some stuff from like the Santa Cruz Mountains and Sierra Nevada foothills can be really delightful and have a little bit more dimension, I think, than some of the Napa stuff, especially the Napa wines from the valley floor, which can be really kind of opulent and sort of delicious in their own way. But on the flip side, they can also be a little bit flabby. Nicole, I will come to your question in just a moment. And then Australia is a great source for some Cabernet, especially if you look for some smaller producers. It's a little bit hard to find some of them, but if you look for stuff, especially from like the Margaret River in the west of Australia, there's some really interesting, less sort of, again, full-throated styles that are really delicious and great expressions of Cabernet, and in some cases from some really old vines as well. Australia has kind of this interesting treasure trove of older vines, not just in Cabernet Sauvignon, but in Syrah and Grenache in particular. There's also some really interesting Cabernet Sauvignon-based wines coming out of Italy, the so-called Super Tuscans. To me, they're kind of a little bit hit or miss in terms of being worth the money. Some of them are very expensive, and I think not necessarily super interesting, but I've also had some excellent Cabernet from Italy. And then here in Washington, which I will kind of finish up by talking about as soon as I answer Nicole's question. But there's, I think, a lot of interesting Cabernet Sauvignon being made here in Washington. So Nicole, to your question about what the best cab I'd recommend, I mean, that's kind of an impossible question to answer without a little bit more context. I would say that, I mean, God, the best cab I would recommend. I will say if you're looking like, price is no consideration. I will say that I'm not necessarily a huge proponent of all these wines from California, but I think that my personal favorite is the Montebello, which is a wine made by Ridge. Ridge is a winery in the Santa Cruz Mountains in California, and the Montebello is their estate vineyard on basically on top of a mountain. It's a pretty remarkable place to go visit. And that is actually usually not 100% Cabernet. It's usually a Cabernet Sauvignon based blend. But I love that wine. I mean, it probably would cost, I don't know what the current retail price is, probably $300 to $400. So again, not cheap. Maybe you could find it for a little cheaper. And it's definitely a wine that you probably don't want to drink when it's super young. It needs some time to come together, but I've had a very fortunate chance to try some older vintages, and it's really remarkable. I'd also say actually one of the other wines that I've been struck by from California is good point, Caitlin, and I still regret you not buying it there. But we do have, another wine would be, I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Oh, yes. So the other one that I think is really kind of an interesting expression and can be really good is actually Robert Mondavi, the Tocolon Vineyard, which is kind of maybe the most famous vineyard in Napa Valley. And I've had the chance again to try some older wines from that vineyard in particular. You want to look for it's the Robert Mondavi Reserve. It should say Tocolon Vineyard on it, and those can be remarkable as well. Similarly priced, I think, to the Ridge wines for sure. Patrick, to your question really quick, the difference stylistically between Old World Cab and New World Cab. I mean, I think what I would say is sort of twofold. One is the differences have to do with ripeness to some extent. I think there are certainly exceptions on both sides. So this is a broad generalization, but you will find more ripeness of fruit on New World Cabernet, both from Washington, from California, from Australia, et cetera, than you typically will in France, with some exceptions. And then I think the other principal difference is there's always been There are certainly wines that are exceptions to this, but and I don't want to get too deep into the sort of the grape chemistry, but basically there are this chemical compound or set of compounds called pyrazines that are present in not just Cabernet Sauvignon, but a lot of the sort of broader Cabernet family, like Sauvignon Blanc, its parent, and Cabernet Franc, its other parent, and they kind of contribute these green notes to the wine, aromatically in particular, but also sometimes flavor. And typically, with most New World Cabernet, that the grapes will be ripened to a point where there's no greenness detectable to the winemaker. Basically, they're trying to ripen those flavor compounds out of the wine. And in Bordeaux, some wineries will do this also, but there's a little bit more of a tradition of maybe not getting your grapes quite that ripe, and so there being a little bit of a green character on the nose and on the palate. And then additionally, there being, I think, probably a little bit more sort of tartness, just maybe more acid period, but also a little bit less ripe for an Old World Cabernet Sauvignon versus New World Cabernet Sauvignon. But again, like I said, there are definitely exceptions, especially these days. There's so much Cabernet Sauvignon being made globally that there are examples in France that you would mistake for California, and there are examples in California or Washington that you would mistake for France, I think. And that's kind of a fun thing. It doesn't mean that you have to know a little bit, or at least be willing to take a chance. I want to finish up with a little bit about Red Mountain and where this wine is from in particular. But so we'll start with the really, really basics of where in Washington State we are. So east of the Cascades, we are at the eastern edge of the Yakima Valley. So about 2/3 of the way through the state, from moving from west to east. We are, fairly far south in the state, but not all the way to the border. And Red Mountain is kind of this one sort of standalone. It's not really a mountain, especially not here in Washington, but it's a big hill, I guess. But Red Big Hill doesn't sound as good as Red Mountain. So there you go. It's particularly noteworthy because it's pretty much all faces essentially due south. And it is consistently kind of the warmest growing site in Washington. And as such, it's always been dominated by red grapes, even when white wine was kind of the more dominant style of wine that was being made here in Washington. Some of the first plantings were in 1975, so 45 years ago now. It's also the smallest, but also the most densely planted AVA, or American viticultural area, in Washington. Like I said, almost exclusively planted to red, although there are some white grapes at a few of the vineyards. And most of what's planted there, as far as red grapes, is Cabernet Sauvignon, though there's some of the other Bordeaux varieties like Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, Malbec, as well as some Syrah and a few other odds and ends. It's also become the sort of big site for a lot of outside investment into Washington wine. So if anyone's drinking I think Kitty's drinking the Canvasback, which is actually a project by Duckhorn, which is a Napa-based winery that bought vineyards and planted vineyards and built a winery on Red Mountain for the purpose of making that wine. And the Aquilini Group, which is a big Vancouver, BC-based investment firm, planted 500 acres on Red Mountain within the last 5 years, which is pretty remarkable. There are only like 2,500 acres in the whole AVA, so they planted like a fifth of it. And one of the main reasons it's so good for growing Cabernet, in addition to the warmth, which Cabernet as a late ripening variety does need, is that Washington is almost exclusively, the vines are almost exclusively irrigated, as opposed to, say, in a lot of parts of Europe where that's against the rules. And even in California, where irrigation is present in some parts and not as present in other parts, kind of depends on where you are. And Cabernet in particular is very sensitive to the amount of water in the soil. So by being on this drip irrigation, where literally the growers in many cases can control the exact amount of water that goes to each vine, let alone each row, you can kind of get the exact right amount of moisture to the vines at any given point in time that you want. And it allows for a lot of control over quality and just the sort of pace at which the grapes ripen, which in a really warm climate is important because you don't want them to race ahead too much. You want to be able to get a full growing season in, even if it's quite hot. I'm going to finish up by talking a little bit about this wine and then some pairings. But again, if there are any other questions, please feel free to ask them now. So Cadence, as I mentioned, I've got the 2015 Cadence Camerata. This is one of my favorite wineries in Washington. Ben Smith, the winemaker and owner, I consider him a friend, which is fun. It's always nice to drink wines that your friends make. And he is actually a former Boeing engineer who decided that was I guess, too calm. So he would do something way more stressful, like make wine and eventually plant a vineyard. And so they planted this vineyard on Red Mountain, I think in the early 2000s. And it's mostly planted to, like I said, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot. And they make two different wines from this vineyard: the Camerata, which is Cabernet Sauvignon based, and then Bel Canto, which is usually a blend of Cabernet Franc and Merlot. And the percentages vary year to year based on how what he thinks of the blend that he's assembling. 2015 was pretty warm. I mean, most vintages in Red Mountain are warm, but 15 was particularly warm. And I will say, I think this wine, I opened it because I wanted to talk about it and share it with you. This wine could certainly have aged for longer. It's only, it's 2015, so this is quite young and probably earlier than I would open this wine on normally. But I wanted to have something that's kind of a current dish vintage to talk about. And I think it's delicious. I love this wine. I love the wines from Cadence pretty much across the board. But like I said, Red Mountain is quite small. There are a number of wineries that are based there. So some of what people have thrown out there, Hedges is also on the mountain itself, and it's a fun winery to visit. The family they're very interesting people. They're fun to hang out with, although occasionally kind of borderline, lunatics, and in a mostly good way. But yeah, a lot of the states, some of the states' most highly regarded vineyards and wines come from Red Mountain, if not in whole, then definitely in part. Last thing I'll say about Cabernet Sauvignon and pairing, the classic pairing with this kind of wine is certainly going to be some sort of red meat. Cabernet Sauvignon in a steak is the classic and certainly delicious. I do think probably with wines from places like Washington and California, depending on the wine, I almost think I want a more, maybe more braised meat than I want like a really kind of lean steak. To me, these wines almost need the sort of added level of sort of richness that you get from like a really nice, like a short rib or, just a beef, braised beef dish. I certainly think this could also go nicely with a really kind of like a deep, I'm thinking of like a earthy dish with like lentils and mushrooms and things like that, if you're not in a meat eating mood. But you definitely want to kind of give the fruit flavors something to play against. So that's where, certainly a meaty dish can work, but also the sort of earthy flavors can go well. Yes, Caitlin says game meat. She would eat venison every day if we could. So, but I don't know if that says much about this wine. But anyhow, I wanted to thank you all again for joining me. Next week will be, I guess, the last two episodes, at least for this iteration of Disgorged, coming up. We'll be doing Vouvray, or Chenin Blanc from the Loire Valley on Saturday, and then we'll be finishing up a week from today with Domaine Carneros, so some sparkling wine from California, but really any sparkling wine you want. It should hopefully do at least some of the trick. If you folks do have any future requests, questions, etc., things that you would like me to cover, all of you know how to get a hold of me some way or another. And again, thanks so much for watching Disgorged Online, and I will be back with you on Saturday.